Hello and welcome to Man Plus Studio. In this edition, we're talking about compression. Compression on the pre, compression on the post. So whether you're tracking or you're in the mixdown process, we want to talk about compression. Now we're actually going to leave limiting out of the deal because of the fact that we'd like to make a separate episode just about limiting and dedicated to limiting. But on this episode, we're going to be talking about compression techniques, the basic functions and tools, and methods that studio pros use. Now, compression, in its basic form and in its most realistic characteristic, is ideally suited for dynamic enhancement. And dynamic enhancement looks different to different engineers, and it has multiple purposes even within the same session. So the same engineer may use dynamic enhancement as a means of control, or compression as a means of control, while and subduing to a certain degree, while the same engineer on a different track may use compression for excitement or to create more energy dynamically in the sound, so that there's actually a little more going on than what was even originally recorded. A lot of great examples of this are overheads, room mics for drums, to accentuate a little more of what's going on rhythmically with the strikes and with the cymbals. So, you know, it really comes down to the overall approach. I think its most basic element, most people understand compression to be a bit of a tool to limit and basically subdue actual performances. You know, and so I think on the onset, most beginners, when they begin to start working with compression, they start to see gain reduction, and they start to see this kind of a leveling out feel, and they utilize it for the purpose of creating more consistency and stability. And while that is very, very true in most cases, and definitely in certain instances in the session, I think on the other side of the spectrum, you still have to remember that compression can be used as a tool to actually provide more dynamic flexibility, not just make it louder. And I think that's kind of the pitfall of the generations that have come after some of these really, really excellent engineers, is that they were never taught the idea of dynamic expression as a high and a low. Instead, a lot of the emphasis has been on dynamic expression on the high side, so make it loud, make it big. You know, so it's one of those things where I think it's a healthy conversation to have, that compression's job is not only to make things loud and make things big, but a lot of times to stabilize their location in the mix, their dynamic performance in the mix. That's kind of a big key here, because once you get outside of being dynamically stable, you know, in certain realms, you lose your overall mix down capability. So let's talk about that. Okay, so, you know, on the one hand, compression can be used to stabilize the performance, to give more stability, more consistency. It doesn't always have to be necessarily more power, you know, or even more punch. You can use compression to give more punch and provide more punch. You can also still use compression to kind of soften or dull the overall attack. And remember, because once we get into the controls, which we'll talk about next, you know, compression actually has an attack and a release timing mechanism. You know, your envelope is being adjusted to a certain degree from a dynamic standpoint. So there's that, and the overall ability to create some stabilization in the audio. There is also the ability to use it more as an effect to be more expressive dynamically. So there is that option as well, and we'll actually listen to some examples of the difference between the two. The big thing, though, we need to solidify, I think, before we rush into the next thing, is just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with how the controls work within compression. Compression controls are very different than a lot of the other controls that you're going to see in processing, but yet there's a lot of familiarities. So, you know, when we talk compression, I think most people understand that the threshold level that you'll see on a compressor is in reference to at what level from a decibel standpoint, at what level the compressor is going to begin to be engaged. So like what volume level will trigger compression. So if overall you have an incoming source, and that incoming source is pegging your meters, and maybe it's close to pegging your meters, maybe it's really just about to breach the 0 mark, and maybe you're at -3 decibels. And if we look at it on the negative scale, as we meter a lot of times on our way towards 0, maybe it's about -3 dB, and you're deciding, what, I'm going to set a compressor up with a threshold level of -5 dB. What that will mean essentially is that each time the source breaches the threshold that past that -5 decibels, essentially it will trigger compression. Now, this is where it all begins to get tricky, because the threshold mechanism is not necessarily the timing device of how compression reacts from a speed standpoint, but it is when the parameters for compression are usable and enacted. So it's like, in order for them to even begin to start their process, compression's just null and void until we breach that threshold mark. Number 2, of course, is the ratio, which is very, very key. So we're talking about compression, and when it comes to the ratio rule is for every blank dB, 1 decibel is allowed to pass through to the output, out of the compressor. So when we're looking at ratios, if I said if it's a 1-to-1 ratio, of course that means that it's equal in, equal out. 1-to-1 ratio means for every 1 decibel that goes in, 1 decibel goes out. If I say it's a 2-to-1, that means for every 2 decibels that goes in, that passes the threshold. So that's a key, is for every decibel past the threshold. So for every blank past the threshold, 1 decibel gets allowed to pass through to the output, and that's the key. So let's say our threshold is set at -5, and we hit up to -3, which is a 2 decibels over the threshold. Those 2 decibels are who we're going to work with. So if I say we're on a 1-to-1, for every 1 decibel that goes past the threshold, 1 decibel is allowed to pass to the output, then essentially 2 decibels are going to be allowed to pass in that instance. But if I said it's a 2-to-1 ratio, the 2-to-1 ratio is for every 2 decibels that pass the threshold, 1 decibel is allowed to pass through to the output. Then that 2-to-1 ratio essentially means for every 2, we get 1 out of the output, which, if you were to think of it fractionally, that's half. All right. So if you switch the ratio into fraction, it's half. If you change it into a percentage, that's 50%. So 2 decibels are going past the threshold in this example on a 2-to-1 ratio, then 1 decibel is allowed to pass. If I said, hey, we're going to use a 4-to-1 ratio, for every 4 decibels past the threshold, 1 decibel gets released or allowed to pass through. On a 4-to-1, you don't actually have to have 4, to work with. It's just you'd have to have 4 decibels to pass the threshold to even get 1. So if you make this a fraction, it's a 1/4, right? A 4-to-1 ratio is a 1/4, or 25%. If I said, hey, going back to my example, -5 decibels, we have -5 decibels and -5 decibels is our threshold marking, and our source just jumped in and breached that threshold, went all the way to -3, then we're 2 decibels past the threshold, and we are then, of course, looking at those 2 decibels. So on a 4-to-1 ratio, what's 1/4 of 2, right? 0.5. So when we look at that, we're looking at that going, okay, so out of those 2 decibels, once I do a 4-to-1 ratio on the output, I can expect that 0.5 decibels will pass through. Now, not to be confused with the idea that that's not the only amount that you'll ever hear. So you're not looking at it going, well, oh, that's weird. My compressor's output will be at 0.5 dB. That sounds really low. You're going to add that whatever value is allowed to pass through, right, past the threshold, you're going to add it to the value that existed before the threshold, below the threshold. So like if you're saying that my threshold was set at -5, then all the way up to -5, I still keep that on my output. I'm just, anything beyond the threshold, we're going to reduce down to that 0.5. So in overall, if I said, well, what's my final output number? It's technically what it'll actually be is, instead of being -5 alone, and instead of being -3, which was the original value, we're going to go ahead and take -5 and we're going to add a 0.5 to it, which in this instance was a subtraction because of the way that the direction we're going. So we actually have -4.5 decibels. So it would be softer than, and there's the compression reaction. Essentially, it'd be softer than where we started. In addition to that, we then have to look at the next set of controls. So there's a bunch of controls in terms of compression, and what's important to keep in mind is that in modern compression, it really developed in the 90s and popularized in the 90s, and it's still kind of what we use today. These are the controls. So if you're working on vintage compressors, you may find they have one knob, they have two knobs. You do need to understand what those knobs do. A lot of vintage compressors will utilize a ratio knob, and they'll utilize a threshold knob, and there's a fixed attack and there's a fixed release, or there's a variable attack and there's a variable release that are basically reacting upon the combination of threshold timing and the amount of compression that's applied, and so there's some mechanisms that may shift based upon those ideas. But now we need to talk about the timing of compression, how compression reacts. So the timing of compression in terms of those values, we use attack and release, and it's just important to understand what they mean and how they're triggered and how they're used. So attack, when it comes to compression, attack is a reference to the timing it takes for your ratio on your compression to go from a 1-to-1, which means no compression, all the way to the user set value. So if you set your ratio to 4-to-1, then your attack time mechanism is responsible for transitioning the compressor from the 1-to-1 state, right, not engaged, all the way to the 4-to-1 state. Okay, so if I said, hey, my attack speed is going to be 5 milliseconds, then your expectation is that it's going to take 5 milliseconds to transition from the 1-to-1 to the 4-to-1. And when that clock starts is when the threshold is breached on the up cycle. So when the threshold is breached from below the threshold, so like, go back to our example, our threshold's -5 decibels, or -5 dB on our metering, and our source has to breach -5 in order for that clock to start ticking. So once our source breaches -5, the clock starts ticking, then you have your 5 millisecond attack time to transition from a 1-to-1 to a 4-to-1. Now, the release timing is the same thing, except it's responsible for the timing of the ratio to go from 4-to-1 all the way back to its neutral state, 1-to-1, where it's not applying compression. And the timing mechanism for that does not start until the threshold is breached on the way down, which means that the audio source essentially would rise above the threshold, and then it has to fall below the threshold before the clock starts for the release. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, what's the whole point of the attack and release? In reality, the compressor, if it was instantaneous on both attack and release, unfortunately would not have a natural sound, and it would be very, very audible in terms of its reaction, specifically if you were reducing the gain overall or applying a lot of compression. So, there's one of those things you kind of have to look at. From an attack and release time, the beauty of the attack and release time is that it really does change, like how you utilize the attack and the release do change how the compressor reacts. And a lot of people will say, well, why not just set everything so it's fast? In reality, that might not be the most natural method. Sometimes if the attack and release are too fast, you start to hear the motion of the compression, and like you as an audience member listening to a song on the radio or on television, all of a sudden you go, wow, I can hear the compression, not in a good way. And that's just kind of one of the keys to making it natural. So you really need that attack and release time. In addition to that, you also, from an attack and release time, you get a lot of expression. And that's kind of one of those big keys. We haven't really talked about the makeup gain yet, which we were about to get to, but if you set your attack time slow enough, a lot of times what you'll find is you'll still get the front end attack of your original source, and then you get this kind of natural compression that comes in. Problem with that is if you look at the envelope of your source, if the envelope of your source has very little going on after the attack, example would be transient sounds like drums, then having a slow attack is going to be painful for you, and it's not going to do its job effectively. Actually, it really won't be doing much of anything at all. It'll be expressing itself on all of the resonance instead of the actual attack, most of which is a room sound because the transients are so quick. So there's that issue, you have to kind of look at. But on the other hand, the attack mechanism can also be very, very beneficial, and it really, really, really can help you out in the overall timing of your source, really to give it a nice smooth blend or transition into compression. Now on the release side, this is where it gets really fun. The release timing, because of how compression is being utilized in release, the release timing can give a very natural expression, but it can also, specifically for snare drum, and I really like the reaction for snare drum and for the room mics, the snare drum, and this is why, like, all you live guys that are out there, you're going, yeah, I know this because I do this all the time. A lot of times, like, as a studio engineer, when you're hanging out with live guys, you realize, a lot of times these guys don't bother miking the bottom of the snare. And, one of the reasons why is because it's susceptible to bleed, and it really isn't a very strong presence in the mix. Two is most live guys early on, because it's something that's really stressed in the live audio industry, understood the timing mechanism of the release on a compressor can actually extract the shell sound of the snare, and of course it can bring out the rattle side of the bottom end of the snare. So it's kind of a beautiful thing. By adjusting the release time on your compressor, you can either tighten the overall snare sound, or you can actually make it a little, essentially looser. Now, if you're in a live field, that looseness essentially is more shell, more bottom resonance, more rattle. When you're in the studio, that release time doesn't just become resonance on the shell and the undersnare. It then becomes an extraction of the room sound. So, adjusting that release mechanism really, really brings out more of that kind of reverberant natural tone of the room, which is why it's so important, because I think that's kind of what's lost in the modern day. It's like, why is it important to have a really good room, sounding studio room? What's the validity of even having a studio room that kind of form these days? It really comes down to that. So moving on, a couple more items, one of which is the knee. Now the knee, again, is a little more of a modern element, but the knee essentially is an adjustment to the transition. So we already have an attack and a release time that are affecting the threshold and the compressor's timing mechanism to apply compression. But the knee itself, the knee is responsible for essentially a timing adjustment before the threshold gets breached. So by having a hard knee, that's usually just typically, by default, you'd end up with a hard knee the higher your ratio is. So like if I have a lower ratio, that transition from 1 to 1 to 2 to 1 isn't really that fierce. But as soon as I have an 8 to 1, then all of a sudden we have a bit of a what we call the knee, and it's essentially how hard of a transition do we make into the compression. Now the knee can be, of course, really after the threshold, can be adjusted with the attack and the release, or really with the attack most of all. But the big thing is that the knee, the job of the actual knee control is to start applying a smoother transition into harder compressions before the threshold is breached. So like if you're saying our threshold's -5, then like right around -6, before we hit that -5 mark on our way up, we're starting to round out that transition as an anticipated element, so that essentially that we transition easier than having it be so fierce. There's your over easy, as they call it on the DBX models. So that's your knee transition, the yellow light, and that if you've ever used the DBX. Essentially, it's just trying to soften your transition, because what'll take place, and it's so weird, is when you're looking at these, kick drum's a great example. When you're on a kick drum, if you've applied too much compression and that knee starts to sound super hard, it really adds like a 1 to 2K tone, and it makes it more punchy, kind of a slappy. But when you put that into the mix, sometimes it becomes a little too dominating because it cuts really well, and so then it makes your kick sound like it's way thinner than it should be. So you kind of have to round that off a little better, or just use less compression. So we have to be kind of careful, remembering that the difference between compression and limiting are going to be the ratio. So anything from a 10-to-1 below is compression. Anything above a 10-to-1 in terms of ratio will be limiting, and that's the difference there. In addition to that, though, we have to talk about the makeup gain. And the makeup gain is the final output state. And, I started working on a vintage compressor recently, and like real vintage compression. And what's really interesting about that is I didn't realize how good we have it now with input controls, an actual input volume adjustment and a makeup gain adjustment. Whereas on some of these vintage devices, the makeup gain was automatically applied the more compression was being applied. And so, you don't have that extra adjustment. The makeup gain essentially is there to supply some sort of volume for your final output, most of which is ideally suited so that if you compressed a lot, and let's say that your compression took away, 8 decibels of your source sound, you essentially created this more sustainable field for your dynamics, but then you still also lost 8 decibels, so you're going to use your makeup gain to essentially compensate, so you'll go plus 8 decibels to get to that point. So essentially the input versus the output are ideally the same. And that's the best way to set up your compressor anyway, because then when you're A-B'ing it or you're bypassing it to see, all right, what does this sound like? You set up your makeup controls so that they sound very even, so that your output with it bypassed sounds, in terms of just the overall output volume, sounds near what it sounds like with a compression. Then you can A-B it successfully and go, oh, yes, this does sound better, versus it just sounds louder and that's the only reason you like it. So you kind of have to be careful about that. One other thing to keep in mind in terms of compression, and we'll have to talk about side chaining on a different episode, is that the idea of actually exporting or outputting the sidechain elements will actually change the overall dynamic characteristics of how you're using your compressor. So, the examples that I'm really providing are for this instance are just, an inline compressor with a single source input, and a basic source output, or it could be a mixed input and a basic output. But we haven't used, in this scenario, we haven't really talked about utilizing other elements that go along with the compressor. One more thing to note, metering is super important. You do need to keep an eye on your input metering and your output metering, but there's also one other thing called gain reduction. Gain reduction metering is very, very beneficial, and gain reduction essentially is the value that's lost when you compress. So in our original scenario where we said we had a 4-to-1 ratio and our threshold was -5, and our overall volume value went up to -3, the original source went to -3, which means we have 2 decibels beyond the threshold. On a 4-to-1, anything beyond the threshold gets the ratio applied on a 4-to-1 ratio. So the 4-to-1 ratio means that essentially if we flip it over, for every 4 decibels beyond the threshold, 1 decibel is allowed to pass through, which means it's equivalent to a 1/4 or a 25% value. So we only look at the 2 decibels that breach that -5 threshold. Out of those 2 decibels, what is 1/4? 0.5. And so 0.5 is added to the -5 value to get our final output, which would be -4.5. But when we look at gain reduction, we're looking at how much is being lost. So out of the 2 decibels we had, I had 0.5 that was allowed to pass through, which means we lost, in terms of gain reduction, we lost 1.5 decibels. So the gain reduction metering is showing how much you're losing, how much is being taken away or applied. It's a great meter to show you, well, the biggest thing is when compression's even being activated. Now, I always teach and promote one healthy idea. These are the 3 ways that you get compression, okay? To get compression, to have compression react, and to make sure your compression's active and activating on purpose and on time, Step one, you have to have a threshold that's low enough to be breached, which means your volumes coming into the compressor have to be loud enough to breach the threshold, or the threshold has to be lowered low enough to be breached. Two, the ratio has to be at anything more than 1-to-1, and for compression it has to be 10-to-1 and lower. So you have to have a ratio of something, in between above 1-to-1 and 10-to-1 and below. So 4-to-1 is great. The other thing is your attack time has to be set fast enough to catch your source, which means if it's a transient, you can't have a slow attack. You have to have attack times that'll actually meet the timing of your source. One of the big keys about that is, and that's why you're like, well, why is this one compressor $100, this other compressor's $5,000? The big key with the differential between those and why there's a discrepancy is because a lot of times, not only just the quality of the parts, but the timing of the VCAs or the optical, or the DCA options, whatever they're using, however they're managing compression, the timing mechanism of the device that's actually controlling the compression, by default, or I should say as it's built, it may have a timing of only being able to go up to a certain value in attack speed, which means that some compressors, if you take their attack all the way fast and you side-by-side them with other compressors with their attack all the way fast, those attack times will not be identical. Essentially, better compressors will a lot of times have faster attack speeds, and they'll have a lot more ability to translate that information correctly. And that's why on the digital side, you see something called a look-ahead. The look-ahead essentially is just something that's supposed to essentially be able to look ahead to what is coming in terms of the audio, so that it can anticipate the need for faster attack timings and kind of compensate for maybe a slow attack mechanism. So, that's a big key. But those are the three main elements in providing compression. Up next, we're going to go to pro tips about how to use compression and essentially what compression is going to do in your mix for you, and how you really should be using it as a professional.
Be sure to check back for all new episodes, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and follow our blog at manplusstudio.blogspot.com.